Now, there were so many great speeches at the No to NATO event that they tried so hard to ban. It might be thought invidious to select one of them as the greatest, but I had no compunction about doing so. The best speech in the entire day, in a galère of big and good speakers, came from Lowkey. It was a tour de horizon, of course talking about the Middle East, from whence his ancestors come, but talking about the world in a way that frankly would have been an impressive speech at the United Nations itself, would have been a speech that would have knocked them out in Harvard or Yale or Oxford. This young man ain't just a rapper, although he's a very good rapper. He is Lowkey. Lowkey, welcome to the show. I want to talk about the anniversaries first, if I may, because it's 20 years Iraq, it's 12 years Libya. These people who committed these crimes are still walking freely amongst us. In fact, they're threatening other people with trial rather than facing trial themselves. How does that make you feel?
Well, firstly, George, thank you so much for the very, very kind introduction. To start with, as you did state, I am of Iraqi origin. Family members who lived through the war are still living with the trauma and the imprint that that has had on their lives. Of course, when we think about that period of time, no one more than you would know that it was a decision that split many people and even split the British elite at that time. You saw in the first month of occupation, the US dropped 29,000 bombs on Iraq. And even before the occupation began, you had the largest no-bid contract in US history, won by, without competition clearly, by a company called Kellogg Brown and Root, which was a subsidiary of Halliburton, of which the vice president, formerly before he became vice president, Dick Cheney, was a director of. You know, throughout the occupation, you saw 1 in 25 Iraqis displaced, and you saw over 1 million people killed. You know, the opposition to the Iraq war was so massive that you saw 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations globally protest against it. And we're talking about 20 years after that, when on average the United States and its allies were dropping 46 bombs per day and displacing between 37 and 59 million people. This has been a massively destructive 2 decades of human history, but there have been winners and there have been companies and individuals that have benefited massively from this. And for me, of course, when looking at the juxtaposition that you have of those like yourself, like Julian Assange, like others who opposed these wars with every fiber in their being, having paid the price for that opposition, and people like Alistair Campbell or George Bush or Tony Blair, seemingly more humanized than ever and more oracleized than ever. These are the people treated in our mainstream society as if they are holders of deep, profound wisdom, when in fact, the human carnage and suffering that has been left in their trail is still there for the world to see. And yet it is ignored in such a horrific way. You look at Fallujah, for example. This was a place where the inhabitants took to the streets to demonstrate against the US military occupying a primary school. And the US military fired upon them. And then it led to a series of events which saw depleted uranium and white phosphorus used in Fallujah. And now you have a 38-fold increase in leukemia, a 10-fold increase in breast cancer. And daily you see children being born with all form of deformities and difficulties And, this is the legacy of this war, and we have to always remind these political figures of the human cost of what they have done and hold them to account. This was the looting of a 4,000-year-old civilization, the basis of so much humanity, which was desecrated by these ghouls.
Such a powerful statement. I'm almost loath to take you back a little, but I feel I must. The people who did all this are not only, of course, now vastly richer for the most part. I've no doubt Dick Cheney got a handsome reward for the no-bid contracts that he handed out. Tony Blair is richer than Croesus, with something like 50 properties throughout the world. Even his 30-year-old son is a multi-millionaire. A complete transformation in the lives of these people. And of course, the journalists and broadcasters that told us that not only was it inescapable, but it was a good thing, are still pontificating today about other conflicts. But they're forced to say something on the 20th anniversary. So they have opted for, it was a mistake. That, of course, sanitizes them from having committed a crime. It was a mistake. It was a blunder, but it was also a crime. And a criminal blunder is, by definition, something you should pay for, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, one of the things that we've also found is the companies that benefited from some of the most ugly parts of these wars. So, for example, Lockheed Martin, which was employed to interrogate people at Guantanamo Bay, later in 2010 carried out the census in England. You then have a company like Khaki International, which was implicated in the torture of Ghraib, was given a big contract for that. It later went on to deliver the census in Scotland. You look at another company like Palantir, which was founded for intelligence operations in the territories the US had occupied as part of the war on terror. And they now seem to have access to our NHS data. So what we actually see is the way the society has absorbed into it many of those companies that, in some cases, like the case of Palantir, were basically set up to service the war on terror. And, the interesting thing about the role that our media played is it almost seemed like a new thing. But actually, when we look at the one of the founders and the first director general of MI5, it was Vernon Kell. Now, Vernon Kell, simultaneous to being an intelligence officer, was actually a correspondent for the Daily Telegraph at that time. So what you have is this way in which we are governed by a media government complex, which works in this weird symbiotic way and is able to astroturf all these kind of ideas within the society to lead us to basically give our consent to these policies, which we should oppose on many different levels. You also have to remember that one of the things that was carried out in Iraq was economic shock therapy, particularly in the first year or so of the occupation under the CPA. You've seen actually huge theft take place at that time. And even the auditor, which was appointed by the US government to examine the accounts of that period, found that at least 12 billion of revenue, which was appropriated by the coalition regime, had not even been adequately accounted for. You saw many other examples where US administrators as part of the CPA were taking part in serious acts of theft in Iraq. You saw Paul Bremer issue 100 legally binding orders, and within those orders, some of them were the deregulation of the labor market, the eradication of import tariffs and trade barriers, a reformed banking sector, which allowed for Iraq's banking sector to be completely owned by foreign companies. You saw the Order 39 particularly, which allowed for the privatization of over 200 state-owned enterprises. Now, according to Article 55 of the Hague Regulations, it is illegal for an occupying country to privatize the country that it occupies assets. And that's what took place. So there's so many different layers of illegality which happened during this period. You literally saw overnight over 50% of the workforce in Iraq become unemployed, and the country largely industrialized. They stopped using pesticides, which killed the date trees, which meant that, it takes 15 years for date trees to mature, and they are only just re-establishing themselves in the date market. They crushed the leather industry, for example, literally going from 200,000 people being employed to 20,000 people being employed. They completely eviscerated the society, George.
When we say that they killed 1 million people in Iraq, some of them, most of them run away, but some of them say, no, it wasn't us that killed 1 million people in Iraq. Many of those, perhaps 3/4 of them, were Iraqis killing Iraqis. But the truth is, the impact of the invasion and the practice of the occupation, particularly in Bremer's period, but not exclusively so, deliberately set about the process, ancient British Empire process of divide and rule. They set Iraqis upon Iraqis as a matter of deliberate policy, didn't they?
Absolutely, and that is something that we have seen them do again and again. The British used Ireland as a laboratory for so many of these ways of working on people and psychological warfare. And of course, that was carried out in Iraq. At the time of the formation of the governing council, they had a quota of how many from each denomination would be taken. And, unfortunately, even the Iraqi Communist Party participated in that pantomime of a political process. And, what you also saw on top of this, George, is reparations not given to Iraqis, but reparations given to US companies. So, for example, you had companies like Halliburton receive $18 million in reparations from the US government for supposed losses that they had suffered during the pre-2003 time. Bechtel were given $7 million in reparations. ExxonMobil were given $2.3 million. Shell were given $1.6 million. Nestle were given $2.6 million. Pepsi were given $3.8 million. Philip Morris, the cigarette company, got $1.3 million of Iraqi money as reparations for supposedly lost income. Even Israeli farmers got $8 million, and Israeli travel agencies and hotels got $15 million. This was really a thieves' banquet of the highest order.
I can't make up my mind. I'm sure the audience will know what I mean. Whether I'd like to see you performing or in parliament, in politics or in art. How are you going to be able as an artist and as a performer to, keep your temper? There's so much to be so angry about. Do you find that this anger that you feel easily translates onto the stage, into your art?
I think it can do, but George, as you know, the parameters of political possibility in our society have grown smaller and smaller across these last 20 years. I remember growing up and being deeply inspired, seeing you on BBC Question Time or seeing you just absolutely demolishing any interviewer that was put in front of you, who was always adversarial. Whether it was speaking on Cuba or defending Hugo Chavez, or of course, supporting the Palestinians. This was something that all of us in our community, we saw, we grew up with and we loved. But we also saw what was done to you within this political system. We saw what was done to Corbyn within this political system. And we also saw the wider push across the society of sort of thought policing, specifically of young Middle Eastern and Muslim youth within British society. So it became harder and harder for us to see any opportunity to really participate directly in the political processes that exist here. And that space has become smaller and smaller. So in a way, music being the, they say politics is the art of the possible. Well, music could be the art of the impossible, in that we are able to speak more frankly and more directly to the powers that be through the music. So yeah, I'm sure there is a relationship there between the feeling of passion that can go into the music, for sure.